Hi everyone, so I'm Mitch again, back today for our day all about Brazil. Thank you, Gustavo, for that great keynote and for James for moderating it. Now we are about to break down the latest MEF Brazil report. So we're going to bring back, we're going to introduce Phil Todd now. And James as well, I think he's going to be joining us, Phil. But hello, good morning, how are you? Well, good afternoon for you, Phil.
And to you too, good afternoon. Very nice to join such an esteemed company.
Very kind, Phil. Thank you.
So, Phil, we'll hand over to you to get stuck into the report, and then we'll probably ask you some questions as we get into the detail.
That's fine. I do tend to go on about these slides quite a bit, so feel free to interrupt me as I go. So what I want to do today is just talk a bit about the new Brazil report that MEF has just published. It's 70-odd pages of detailed insight and data and charts. It's a really good read, if I say it myself. What I'm going to do today is just pick some highlights from the various areas, just to give you a flavour of what's included in it. And hopefully you can all see my screen as I go through. Let's get to the right. There we go. So just a brief, really, before we get into some of the nuts and bolts, the Brazil report is based on a comprehensive survey that MEF has done, covering 6,500 smartphone users worldwide, of which 650 sit in Brazil. So it's 10 countries, as I said, 650 respondents per country, and a lot of segmentation within that data that allows us to start to drill down into the demographics of what type of users are doing what. So it's a rich data set that we start off with. And for this particular report on Brazil, we focused on 5 areas of the smartphone user life, if you like. We look at the type of mobile apps that are used in Brazil. We look at a bit about messaging preferences. We look at payment experiences, harking back to the session we've just been listening to. What's going to drive payments? What are people using payments for? Importantly, we also touch about trust and personal data and things to do with that, which I think again touches on the previous session as well. And then we also have the last area looking at smartphones and a bit about the hardware and platforms in use in Brazil, that sort of thing. So without further ado, let's just dive into this. And I'm going to start off with a few slides looking at the way mobile apps are used within Brazil. And I think where I can, I'm also giving you a comparison to the global figure as well. So I think one of the key things to say here is that within the Brazil market, users are very keen on using their mobile apps. Of all the countries we looked at, the 10 countries, users in Brazil are the most avid users of pretty much all these types of apps that we looked at, from playing games, watching video, through to booking food deliveries. Brazilian users are more avid users of all these than we see in other countries around the world that we've researched. And we can pick out one or two things particularly in here. We can see that obviously playing games is on your mobile is just nudging ahead of listening to music, but these are all ahead of the global figures. But I'd also draw your attention to there's an interesting figure there, again, compared to what we were listening to just now. Accessing my bank via my mobile, whether it's an app or via the website, is quite a long way ahead of the global figure there, which is quite interesting. And we can also see that there are one or two areas where Brazil has got some, is not so leading. So we can see right down towards the bottom of the chart there to do with using a fitness app, a little bit behind the global figure there. And again, a lot of these things can be couched in terms of the broader Brazilian market, what the social preferences and availability of services in some cases as well. But that gives you an idea of where Brazil sits in terms of the global landscape of other countries. Now, one of the most interesting things I found in analysing this report, data for the report, is that although we can see that Brazil is ahead in terms of overall sort of people who've ever used these apps, there's a very interesting dynamic here in terms of how often people actually use the apps. And here we can see that although we saw on the previous chart that playing games on a mobile was the most popular app activity, the frequency of doing it is really low compared to all the other global countries. So just picking on that, playing a game again, for people who've used it ever in the last 6 months, 78% of users worldwide use it at least weekly. Brazil, 35%. It's half the figure, which is quite interesting. And that's true for pretty much all these types of mobile app with the social media, listening to music, watching video clips, things like that. The actual frequency of use within Brazil is much lower than you see elsewhere. And having done a bit of asking around within MEF and a bit of background contextual research, there's clearly something here to do with cost of data, cost of mobile packages that just makes users within Brazil very careful about their use of data and the costs that they're going to be racking up in using their apps. They love the apps, but they're very, very careful about how they use them, the frequency of use. Downloading infrequently, watching then offline more frequently, things like that, to try and preserve the data and manage their costs as they go along, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic that we see there. And the last of my 3 slides about mobile apps, one of the questions we asked, well, what can we do? What could be done to drive more usage? How can we make things used more widely? And this again is quite interesting. There are obviously usually some specific things around the memory on my phone is too small. We see that in Brazil. On the chart here, the global figures are in green, Brazilian figures are in orange. But I think one of the most interesting things though was there's a lot of people out there who say, well, I don't really limit the use of my mobile apps. So the only thing that's going to get them to use more is having something that is innovative. The top of the chart here, you can see, I have no need for more services because nothing's being presented to them that is really going to excite them or ignite their interest. So there's an innovation opportunity here to really drive greater use of different sorts of mobile app, because it doesn't seem to be, apart from the phone hardware itself, there's not a sort of a cultural resistance to doing more. It's just a fine, show me something that's interesting and I'll have a go at it. So I think that's an opportunity there for app developers and networks to think about what they can do to create a more exciting environment for people to actually try and use more apps. Going on to messaging, again, my cherry picking of slides around messaging, looking at the way that people receive commercial messages on their mobile. Now, excluding email, users in Brazil, it's the second largest country in terms of their users receiving business messages via their mobile. 92% have received a commercial message. They're only beaten by China at 94%. So clearly there's a lot of commercial messaging going on. This doesn't include email. This is just via SMS and other OTT methods and so on. So there's a lot of commercial messaging going around. Now there is, of course, then a downside to this, as we can see on the next slide, which is there's a lot of unsolicited messaging that is being received as well. Now the countries here, there's a slight reordering in terms of the top 4. China's still top there overall. They receive the most messages overall. They receive the most unsolicited messages overall. Brazil has dropped down to 3rd place just in terms of the number of smartphone users who ever received an unsolicited message of some sort, which they would class as spam, something that wasn't expected, wasn't initiated, wasn't welcome, I suppose, in that sense. So there's that sort of the flip side to the proliferation of messaging, which I think is quite interesting. We also asked about, so what are the channels that are used for receiving business messages? Now here we're just looking at Brazil, and again, Brazil is different from the global figure. Brazilian users seem very keen on WhatsApp compared to the global figure, and the global figure is less than half of that. Here we see 59% of users in Brazil that we surveyed have received a business message via WhatsApp. That's more than double the global figure, which I think is quite an interesting change to what you would see overall. What I do think though is that there's clearly an opportunity to do more use of SMS. It's not used that heavily. It's a little bit lower than the global average. The global average figure was, I think, 33% of users receiving SMS business messaging. So it's slightly lower in Brazil. So there's an opportunity there to think about how that could be used more. I don't think there's an intrinsic resistance to receiving SMS versus other methods, but there's clearly WhatsApp is one of the biggest channels used at the moment, which I think is a different thing to what you see globally, which is quite interesting. Overall, we talked about receiving spam messages and unsolicited messages. If we look at the overall environment of receiving, we call them messages related to harm, and we'll see as we go through this. At the bottom there, you can see it's receiving unsolicited messages compared to the global figure, slightly higher at 45% versus 39%. But there are other sorts of messaging that are unwelcome as well, sort of phishing messages, things like that. So, and here Brazil is slightly ahead of the global figure again, unfortunately. So 31% of our users in Brazil have received an email that they felt was trying to steal personal sensitive data, compared to a 29% figure globally. And in terms of text messages as well, 30% say they felt they've received a text message that was not just unwelcome, but seen to be wanting to try and steal data, asking them to click on links and things like that. And again, these are ahead of the global figure, so there's some issues here around that sort of receiving unsolicited messages that then can potentially be quite harmful. Only 13% of our users have never received any of these types of message at all, compared to 20% globally. So that there's a bit of an issue here that could be unpacked a bit more with more digging into data. I've got a few slides here now about looking at payments. And again, this relates back to the previous session as well. Now here we're talking about payments in the sense of using their users using their mobile bill in order to pay for additional services. So as I said in the title there, Brazil is strong in terms of content subscription and using their mobile bill to pay for things like Netflix, Spotify, other sort of subscription services. And these aren't necessarily ones that have come with the phone as a bundle. So in the second set of data going across there, you can see that in Brazil, 45% of our users have paid for some sort of subscription via their bill, but only 30% of them are using that in terms of that sort of bundle of services already included. So quite a number are going out and sourcing an additional subscription to pay via their mobile bill, which is quite an interesting and clearly ahead of the global figure, which is only 32% versus that 45%. The idea of paying for one-off services, a bit less than the global figure. Only 19% of users in Brazil have paid for that sort of one-time payment, for instance, to download something that's not as part of a subscription or a broader agreement. So that's quite interesting. So there's clearly an appetite for subscribing to services, but I think we also need to think about this in the context we saw in terms of payments, and that being mindful how users are using their data. That there'll be a lot of management by users around how that works in practice and how often they actually do this. So there's quite a sort of a little ecosystem of issues there, if you like, that affects not just whether they're using it, but how often they use it as well, which I think are two sort of sides of the same coin. Now, we talked in the previous session, there was some concern about some comments about the concern about mobile payments, and clearly the users do have some concerns. And again, in this chart, Brazilian users are in blue, global figures are in orange. There's clearly some concern about unauthorized future payments that aren't approved. 37%, over a third of users have a concern that there may be future payments that aren't authorized. 34%, again, just over a third, have concerns that payment details could be stolen. So there are issues here that are going to hold back greater use of mobile payment. Again, here we're talking about mobile payment via the mobile bill. There's concern about overbilling, concern about a little bit about spending too much. It can be quite easy to spend without realizing. So there are issues here that can be of concern around holding back greater use of payments via the mobile bill. And again, although those were concerns, we can see here, we actually said, have you actually experienced overcharging on your bill? 24% of users in Brazil have said, yes, I can recall an instance where I was incorrectly charged by my mobile operator. That's the highest of any of the countries that we looked at. The global average is about 15%. Users in Japan seem to enjoy pretty much the most accurate billing at 5%, only 5% of experienced overcharging or incorrect charging. So there's, as well as that sort of concern we saw on the previous chart, there's an actual experience of overcharging as well, which kind of feeds into that concern. So there's something there that is in that sort of payments world that will need to be thought about and addressed if we're really going to look at ways to use payment via the mobile bill in a more widespread sort of way. So that there's things there that we need to have a look at. I've got a couple of slides here about personal data and trust, because this is an area that is of increasing interest, and I think it has some real world impact. This isn't a theoretical area from a research point of view. What we're looking at here are importance of trust issues in relation to personal data. Now, it's interesting that, again, looking at the chart, global figures are in orange, Brazil is in blue. There's not a lot of variation sort of across all these separate issues. We're talking about how important is it that mobile apps and services keep my data secure? How important is it that mobile apps respect my privacy, and so on? So this is on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is extremely important. Even globally, it only gets to a 4. But in Brazil, there's a little bit. It's seen as being a little bit less important, which I think is surprising, given that some of the other data that we've looked at in terms of payments and so on. And use of services, what would drive more use of services? One of the things we saw there was, well, they want to trust apps that they're using, and then they might use them more. So these are all rather middle of the road, and a little bit lower than the global figure, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic going on there. However, we then asked people, so what have you done where you've had a concern in relation to an app or a service? You're concerned about their handling of your data, of your personal data. Sort of, so what? And the so what is that 45% have deleted an app or service because they have concerns about how that app or service is handling their personal data. 45% have actually taken action and deleted an app. 41% have avoided installing an app in the first place. That's pretty good. That's pretty good as in terms of data. There's a lot of action going on there. 37% have warned their friends and family. That's a high number. So clearly there are some real world consequences of apps either not handling their personal data well, or not showing people that they take it seriously. So there's something there around not just handling data, but the perception of handling personal data well. So that there are some genuine consequences of getting this right and getting this wrong, which I think is interesting and is something that app providers and networks need to have a think about in terms of what are the consequences of this going wrong. Now, my last couple of slides just cherry pick some of the information around platform and hardware in Brazil. And again, what slides I'm showing you here are Brazil on the left, global on the right, and we've got a time series here as well. So the blue is 2019, orange is 2020. So just looking at Brazil, very much an Android market, 90% in 2019, falling slightly to 87% of users having an Android platform versus an iOS. So so over that 1 year, there's a slight shift away from Android towards iOS a little bit. This is quite a different figure from where we're looking at the global figures on the right, where while it's still Android centric, it's not quite such an extreme situation. Globally, according to our entire survey, 30-odd%, and a fairly consistent 30-odd% are iOS versus a fairly consistent just under 70% being Android. and that seems to be only slowly changing, and we'll need to have a few more years to see any sort of broader movement on that. And my last chart that I want to show you today, looking at the actual hardware that is in use. Again, we've got same sort of thing, Brazil at the top, global at the bottom, and you've got 2019 versus 2020. In Brazil, it's very much a Samsung market, followed by Motorola, and you can see Apple there in third place. Now, again, there's some interesting dynamics in terms of how these market shares, if you like, are starting to change ever so slightly. Samsung is falling a little bit because Apple is increasing it, but you also see Xiaomi going up a bit, LG going up a little bit, Motorola being fairly static. Now, compared to the global figures, of course, this is a bit different. Globally, you see Apple and Samsung slugging it out in terms of hardware, Apple versus Android. Samsung is still the biggest Android hardware, but here now you see Huawei and others starting to be having a bigger share, and you can start to see some dynamics there. Globally, Samsung is starting to increase, whereas in Brazil it's starting to fall a little bit. So you can see these sort of market positions jockeying around year on year, and you can see other players coming in the global market that you don't see so much in the Brazilian market as well. So there's all this and more within the overall report. We slice and dice by other demographics. You can look at the differences in platform and hardware by male and female preferences, by age group, even by income group as well. So there's quite a lot more in there that I would urge you to go and have a look at, because it's a rich data set, which I think is very informative. And I believe also the full data is available via the MEF website as well. So that's really all the slides I want to talk through today. I know that it's rather slide heavy and I've run through that at pace, but I wanted just to give you a flavour of the breadth and depth of what there is in the report, and I would certainly commend it to people to go and have a look at.
Brilliant. Yeah, great. Thanks, Phil. And so just to recap, you can go download the full report right now in the MEF booth, which you'll find in the exhibitor section. So do that now whilst just listening to us. So first of all, it was great when you started off, because the first thing that came out was that gaming was at the top of the app penetration list, and then also you talked about how the sense of phishing in Brazil is above the global average, which is perfect because our next session's about phishing and the one after is about clapping. So it was good to see that our program's on point.
Well, hopefully we're all all saying the same message. So
yeah. About the trust in services. So obviously Gustavo talked about this in the keynote, and I was just wondering, based on the other markets that you see, where in the markets where there is high trust in financial services, do we get any data about what's working there? Because one of the things we talked about yesterday was in terms of the value chain, with operators getting involved with mobile payments as well, direct calibrating. Where does the trust? Is it from the end brand that have the relationship with the customer? Is it with the financial institutions who enable that payment?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because it can be quite sort of glib to say, well, obviously it's a trust thing, and the headline is yes, there's a big trust thing. Where does the trust lie, and where are the levers that one can pull? And that is an interesting topic, and I think there are questions we've asked at a global level around what type of player in the ecosystem do you trust more? Now, what I found in this and in other research, actually there's not a lot of sort of, you can't say, well, there's one front runner there. Everybody trusts the bank, or everybody trusts the mobile company, or everybody trusts the app developer. It's I don't necessarily think that the end users are that, this will sound terrible, are that sophisticated in being able to allocate trust to the different sorts of person within that sort of ecosystem. It's a broad amalgam, which means, I think, that if one type of player drops the ball, everybody gets caught, and if one type of player actually makes it really good, then actually it raises the whole game as well. So I think that there's a vested interest in everybody working together to try and work out how to not just handle data better, to engender more trust, but also to communicate that. Because quite a lot of this is about perception. I think in one of some of the slides we saw here, there's a perception of worry, and then there's a perception of actual harm, if you like. And the two aren't the same. More people are worried than have actually experienced phishing emails, for instance, or something like that. So there's a communications job to be done around all of this, about that it's not as bad as you think, but then actually there's a real job to do actually to make it not as bad as you think as well. But I don't think you can sort of pin a sort of a rosette on any one type of player and say, well, actually the banks are going to be the best people to do this because they've got track record. Because every day we hear about phishing attacks on mobile networks. There's one only yesterday about data breaches, and this seems to be ever increasing. So I think what that tends to mean is that there's an ever increasing requirement to communicate and handle this well, because it's a problem that doesn't appear to be going away. So the way in which you work through these issues and present them back to users and manage that and manage the communication, and also shore up confidence on, is going to become ever more critical as we go on.
I mean, just to share, like, one of the paradoxes that I've seen whilst, the time I've been living here is, for instance, we've seen a lot of neobanks coming up, right? So Nubank is a great example, and they obviously position themselves as a new trustworthy service. Yet there is a certain level of distrust around digital banks who don't have a physical interface. Yet at the same time, on the other side, it's clearly obvious that the traditional leading banks, they're also not trusted. So it seems like customers are kind of conflicted, right? They've got the traditional banks.
I think that's right. You could say, well, this is a bit of a lose-lose, but you could easily flip it and say, well, there's possibly a win here as well. That people, if there's a sort of a generic distrust of old banks because they've been here forever and they haven't done what I wanted them to do, so I don't feel that disposed towards them, for instance. Therefore, a brand shiny new all digital bank with no baggage, that's great. But you're starting from having no sort of heritage of doing things well. So it means that if you are going to make an impact in terms of trust, you've got to be able to from the get-go demonstrate that you understand these things, you're able to communicate, talk about the ways in which you're keeping people safe, not necessarily sort of better than X, Y, or Z, but just take a bit of high ground, as it were, and say, we've watched what's going on, we're doing things better, we see how to do things better, and sort of asking for the trust, if you like. And I think there's something there that could be done that would take advantage of issues with some of the existing providers, maybe.
Great. Well, that's all from me. James, I think your mic is off. You're on mute, James. Just go ahead.
The host.
There you go.
Oh, there you go.
So there we go. Thank you. The host had muted my mic, but I'm back. It wasn't me for a change. I haven't done it yet. I usually do it 3 times during an event, but it wasn't me, Governor, this time. But no, Phil and everyone, I think Phil did the global survey, and the Brazil data is a subset, expanded out to about 40 pages. And the global survey is amazing, and I commend that to you all to have a look at. That's over 80 pages. And for what me really stood out is what you first mentioned, Mitch, and that's the fact that gaming is the #1 used app. And we've got a session about cloud gaming later. So that's absolutely huge. I never expected that. I thought it would be chat. But then, of course, psychology also comes into play, because a really important thing, and I only learned it a couple of weeks ago, is that in Japan, consistently voted #1 or #2 most technologically advanced country on earth, cash is still king, because it's in the psyche, it's in the culture. So it's the reports that we come out with from MEF bring all of this to light. And Phil, thank you very much for your time today. And Mitch, I think we've got to cut this, because the next session is all about SMS phishing, which is coming up now. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.